I leaned against the counter at Bloom Deli, the hum of the lunchtime crowd buzzing in my ears like static on a bad radio. The air smelled of rye bread and smoked pastrami, thick enough to make my stomach growl despite the tension coiling inside me. It was a Tuesday, nothing special about it, just another day in the grind. Yet here I was, waiting for a turkey on whole wheat, wondering how a simple sandwich order could turn into a battlefield. The deli wasn't much to look at. Chipped linoleum floors, a glass case smudged with fingerprints, and a menu board with half the letters peeling off. But it was mine, in a way, a reliable escape from the polished chaos of my office at S&T Group. I liked the noise here, the clatter of trays and the shouts of the line cooks. It drowned out the constant hum of ambition that followed me everywhere else. That and the sandwiches were damn good. I adjusted my coat, the wool brushing against my wrists, and glanced at my watch. 12:47. I had exactly 13 minutes before I needed to be back at my desk, poring over contracts worth more than this entire block of storefronts. The line moved slow, but I didn't mind. Not yet. Patience was a skill I'd honed over years of navigating boardrooms and backroom deals. Then I heard her. "Look, it's supposed to be half off." A voice snapped, sharp and loud enough to cut through the deli's din. "The sign says so. You're not going to rip me off over a lousy sandwich, are you?" I turned my head just enough to see her, a woman in a cheap blazer, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that looked like it was losing a fight with gravity. She was jabbing a finger at the cashier, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, his face flushed red as he stammered something about store policy. The woman, Amy, I'd later learn, had a stack of crumpled coupons clutched in her other hand, and her voice carried that grating mix of entitlement and desperation I'd heard too many times in my line of work. I shifted my weight, irritation flickering in my chest. The line wasn't moving now, thanks to her little standoff. A guy behind me muttered something under his breath, and an older woman with a tray of soup glared like she might chuck it at Amy's head. I couldn't blame them. This wasn't a negotiation table at Pinnacle Bank or a closed-door meeting with S&T's board. It was a deli, for God's sake. But Amy didn't seem to care. She leaned closer to the cashier, her voice rising. "I come here every week," she said, as if that made her royalty. "You're telling me you can't honor a discount? What kind of scam are you running?" The cashier fumbled with the register, his hands shaking. "Ma'am, I don't set the prices." "It's just what?" She cut him off, smirking like she'd caught him in a lie. "Just that you think I'm stupid? I know how this works. You're pocketing the difference, aren't you?" I almost laughed. Almost. There was something absurd about her. Her righteous indignation over a sandwich that couldn't have cost more than $8. Part of me wanted to step in, flash my EVP card, and tell her to take her coupons and her attitude somewhere else. But I didn't. Not yet. I was curious, in a twisted way, to see how far she'd push it. Besides, I'd learned long ago that power wasn't about jumping into every fight. It was about picking the right moment to strike. The cashier finally caved, muttering an apology as he punched in the discount. Amy straightened up, victorious, and tossed her coupons onto the counter like she'd just closed a $1 million deal. She didn't even glance at the rest of us, me, the guy behind me, the soup lady, as she grabbed her sandwich and strutted toward a table by the window. The line lurched forward again, and I stepped up to order, my irritation simmering into something else. Amusement, maybe. She had no idea who she was brushing shoulders with, no clue that the woman in the tailored coat behind her could bury her entire existence with a single phone call. I placed my order, turkey on whole wheat, no mayo, and watched her from the corner of my eye as I waited. Amy sat there, unwrapping her sandwich with the smug satisfaction of someone who'd beaten the system. She didn't notice the way the other customers avoided her table, or the way the cashier kept glancing at her like she might start another war over the pickle spear. She was oblivious, and that made her dangerous in a small, petty way. People like her didn't just annoy you, they chipped away at your patience until you snapped. I picked up my tray and headed for a seat across the room, far enough to keep her in my peripheral vision, but close enough to hear if she started up again. The deli was a microcosm of everything I'd fought my way out of: petty squabbles, small stakes, People clawing over scraps while I sat at the top of an empire most of them couldn't even fathom. I took a bite of my sandwich, the bread crunching under my teeth, and let my mind drift. S&T Group's latest acquisition was closing tomorrow, a $100 billion deal that would make headlines. I'd spent months orchestrating it, outmaneuvering rivals who'd underestimated me because I didn't flaunt my power like some Wall Street caricature. And here I was, watching Amy haggle over a discount like it was her own personal crusade. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd clawed my way up from nothing, small-town diners, dead-end jobs, a family that thought ambition was a dirty word, to become Susan Tillman, Executive Vice President of S&T Group. I'd faced down tycoons and politicians without blinking, turned losses into wins with a smile and a steel spine. Yet something about Amy's little performance gnawed at me. Maybe it was the entitlement, the way she assumed the world owed her something. Or maybe it was the reminder of where I'd started and how close I'd come to staying there. I finished my sandwich, brushing crumbs off my fingers, and checked my watch again. 12:58, time to go. I stood, smoothing my coat, and cast one last glance at Amy. She was still at her table, scrolling her phone, oblivious to the storm she'd stirred up. I could have left it there, should have left it there. But as I stepped out into the cold February air, the irritation lingered, sharp and insistent. I didn't know it yet, but that moment in Bloom Deli was the first thread in a tangle that would pull me back into a fight I didn't expect, one that would test every ounce of power I'd built and every shred of restraint I had left. The next morning, I woke with the taste of yesterday's irritation still bitter on my tongue. Bloom Deli felt like a distant skirmish, a petty annoyance I should have shaken off by now. I'd faced down corporate sharks and hostile takeovers. Why was I letting some coupon-waving nobody linger in my head? I pulled on my coat, the same old one from yesterday, and told myself it was done. Over. I had bigger battles to fight. By 9:15, I was striding through the glass doors of Pinnacle Bank, my heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome keeping time to my pulse. The lobby stretched out before me, all polished stone and sleek lines, a cathedral to money and power. Chandeliers hung overhead, casting soft light on the teller's counters, where men and women in crisp suits moved with the quiet efficiency I'd come to expect. This was my world, controlled, precise, a place where I called the shots. I needed to withdraw $30,000 in cash for a discrete payment tied to the S&T acquisition. Routine or so, I thought. I approached the counter, sliding my ID and account details across the polished surface to a teller with a practiced smile. He nodded, tapped at his keyboard, then froze. His eyes flicked up to mine, then back to the screen, a faint crease forming between his brows. "Miss Tillman," he said, voice low, "I'll need to escalate this. It'll just be a moment." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Escalation wasn't unusual for a withdrawal this size. Protocol, red tape, the usual dance. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and let my gaze drift. The air smelled faintly of leather and disinfectant, a sterile contrast to the deli's chaos. A man in a pinstripe suit argued quietly with another teller, his voice a muted hum. Behind me, the soft chime of the entrance doors punctuated the morning rush. I checked my watch. 9:22. Fine. I had time. Then I saw her. She emerged from a side office, her cheap blazer swapped for a bank-branded vest, that same messy bun teetering on her head. Amy, the sandwich warrior from Bloom Deli. My stomach tightened, a mix of disbelief and something sharper, amusement, maybe, at the sheer absurdity of it. She worked here? At Pinnacle of all places? I watched her shuffle papers behind the counter, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was savoring every second she could waste. The teller who'd taken my ID approached her, murmuring something I couldn't catch. Amy glanced at the screen, then at me, and her lips curled into a smirk I recognized from yesterday. Well, she said, loud enough for me to hear, though she pretended to address the teller. Looks like someone thinks they're a big shot today. My fingers twitched against my sleeve. I kept my face neutral, but inside, irritation flared hot and fast. She didn't know who I was, not yet, but that smirk told me she didn't care. She saw a woman in a nice coat and assumed I was just another entitled customer she could toy with. I straightened, meeting her gaze across the counter. Her eyes narrowed, daring me to react. "I need $30,000 withdrawn," I said, my voice calm, clipped.
Cash. Now.
Amy leaned forward, resting her elbows on the counter, like we were old friends.
Oh, now, huh?
That's cute. You got an appointment for that. Or do you just expect us to jump when you snap your fingers? The teller beside her shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between us. I ignored him, locking onto Amy. "It's my money. I don't need an appointment to access it." She snorted, tapping lazily at the keyboard. "Yeah, well, it's not that simple. There's paperwork, verification, rules." She dragged out the last word, her smirk widening. "Might take a while. You got somewhere to be."
I did.
A meeting at 11 o'clock with S&T's legal team to finalize the acquisition. I could feel the clock ticking, each second she stalled slicing into my patience. The lobby felt smaller now, the air thicker, pressing against my chest. I glanced around. Other customers moved through their transactions smoothly, oblivious to the slow-motion power play unfolding at my window. Amy wasn't just delaying me. She was enjoying it. "Fine," I said, forcing a tight smile. "Verify it. I'll wait." Her eyebrows shot up, like she hadn't expected me to call her bluff. She shrugged, turned back to the screen, and started typing, agonizingly slow, one finger at a time. The teller next to her muttered something about a manager, but she waved him off. "I've got this," she said, her tone dripping with fake confidence. "She's not in a rush, right?" I was. And she knew it. I could see it in the way she glanced at me sidelong, testing how far she could push before I snapped. My hands curled into fists inside my coat pockets, nails digging into my palms. I'd spent years perfecting control over myself, over situations, over people who thought they could outmaneuver me. But this petty, spiteful game from someone who didn't even know the stakes? It lit a fuse I hadn't felt in a long time. Minutes dragged by.
5, 10.
15. The lobby hummed around me, but my world narrowed to Amy's smug face and the clack of her keyboard. My irritation hardened into something else, resolve, maybe, or the first stirrings of a plan. She thought she was winning, dragging this out to prove some petty point. She had no idea who she was dealing with. At 9:47, she finally looked up, sliding a stack of forms toward me. "Need your signature. And ID again. Oh, and we'll have to count the cash by hand. Policy." Her voice was syrupy, fake apologetic. "Might be another hour. Hope that's okay." I stared at her, my pulse steady now cold. An hour. She was betting I'd back down, walk away, let her have her little victory. She didn't know I'd waited out worse. Boardroom standoffs that lasted days, negotiations where every second was a weapon. I picked up the pen, signed the forms with a flourish, and slid them back. "Do it," I said. "I've got all day." Her smirk faltered, just for a second, but I caught it. She didn't expect me to stay. Didn't expect me to dig in. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and settled into wait. The lobby's gleam faded into the background, the chandeliers and marble blurring as my focus sharpened. This wasn't about $30,000 anymore. It was about her arrogance, her ignorance, her assumption she could toy with me and walk away unscathed. I didn't know it then, but that moment at Pinnacle Bank was the real turning point. Not the deli, not the sandwich squabble. This was where the thread tightened, where the tangle began to pull me into a fight I hadn't planned for. Amy didn't just delay me that day. She woke something up, something I'd buried under years of calculated moves and careful restraint. And as I stood there, watching her count out bills like she was doing me a favor, I felt the first flicker of a question I couldn't shake. How far would I go to make her pay? The stack of bills sat between us, a tidy pile of 20s and 50s that Amy had counted out with the exaggerated care of someone auditioning for a role she didn't deserve. Her fingers lingered on each one, smoothing the edges, flipping them over like She was inspecting them for flaws. The clock above the teller windows read 10:12, and the air in Pinnacle Bank's lobby felt heavier now, thick with the weight of her game and my refusal to fold. I stood there, arms still crossed, my coat brushing the counter's edge, and watched her drag this out. She thought she had me cornered, trapped by her petty bureaucracy, forced to bend to her whims. She was wrong. Almost done, she said, her voice a mockery of professionalism. She didn't look up, but I could feel the smirk in her tone, the same one she'd flashed at Bloom Deli yesterday. Gotta make sure it's all here. Wouldn't want you shortchanged, right? I let out a low laugh, sharp enough to make the teller next to her flinch. Oh, I'm not worried about that, I said, leaning forward just enough to catch her eye. You're too thorough for that, Amy. Her hands paused, the bills fanning out mid-count. She glanced up, her smirk twitching into something less certain. You know my name? Your vest, I said, nodding at the cheap plastic name tag pinned to her chest. Hard to miss. She blinked, then recovered, brushing it off with a shrug.
Right.
Well, good to know you're paying attention. Most people don't bother with the little folks like me. There it was, the bait, the self-pitying jab she thought would sting, or at least annoy me enough to back off. Little folks. I almost laughed again, louder this time, but I swallowed it. She had no idea how ridiculous she sounded, how far off the mark she was. I'd spent my life clawing past people who saw me as little, family who sneered at my dreams, bosses who thought I'd stay a secretary forever, rivals who underestimated me until it was too late. And here was Amy, a bank teller with a chip on her shoulder, thinking she could rattle me with a line like that. Trust me, I said, my voice steady. I notice more than you think. Her eyes narrowed, searching my face for a crack she wouldn't find. I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch, the hum of the lobby fading into a dull roar in my ears. The marble floor gleamed under my feet, cold and unyielding, a stark contrast to the heat building in my chest. I didn't just want the $30,000 anymore. I wanted her to feel this, to realize she'd picked the wrong person to toy with. But I wasn't ready to show my hand.
Not yet.
She broke first, dropping her eyes back to the bills. Whatever, she muttered, stacking them with a little more force than necessary. You're still gonna wait. Bottom-tier accounts like yours take time. That did it. The laugh I'd been holding back slipped out, short and dry, echoing off the counter. Bottom tier. She thought I was some mid-level exec with a padded checking account, scraping by on a salary she could comprehend. It was absurd, hilarious, even, and for a moment I let myself enjoy it. The idea that Susan Tillman, EVP of S&T Group, a woman who just orchestrated a $100 billion acquisition, was bottom tier in Amy's tiny, coupon-clipping world. I could have corrected her right then, could have dropped my title like a guillotine blade, and watched her scramble. But where was the fun in that? Bottom tier, I repeated, rolling the words around like they were a punchline. That's a new one. She bristled, mistaking my amusement for mockery aimed at her. Yeah, well, don't get too full of yourself, she snapped. I see people like you all the time. Fancy coat, big attitude, but when it comes down to it, you're just another number in the system. I tilted my head, studying her. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across her face. Her bun was slipping now, strands of hair sticking out like frayed wires, and her vest hung crooked on her shoulders. She looked tired, worn down, maybe. But there was a spark in her eyes, a stubborn defiance that made this more than just a job to her. This was personal. She didn't know me, didn't know my story, but she decided I was the enemy. And that made her dangerous in a way I hadn't expected. Maybe, I said, keeping my tone light, but I'm still here. And you're still counting. Her jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought she might snap back. But she didn't. She shoved the bills into a neat stack, slid them into an envelope, and pushed it across the counter with a flick of her wrist.
There.
30 grand. Happy now? I didn't move, didn't reach for it. I just stood there, letting the envelope sit between us like a challenge. The lobby felt smaller now, the air pressing in, thick with the tension I'd built by refusing to play her game her way. I could feel the other tellers watching, their hushed conversations stalling as they sensed something shifting. My pulse was steady, but inside, I was buzzing, irritation mixing with a strange, electric thrill. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about her, about the way she'd tried to grind me down and failed. Not quite, I said, my voice low, deliberate. But I'll let you know. Her smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion. She opened her mouth to say something, another jab, probably, but I beat her to it, picking up the envelope and tucking it into my coat. Thanks for the service, Amy. You've been memorable. I turned on my heel, the click of my boots echoing through the lobby as I headed for the doors. I didn't look back, didn't need to. I could feel her staring, could imagine the way her hands were probably clenched under the counter, her mind racing to figure out what she'd missed. Outside, the February air hit me hard, sharp and cold, snapping me out of the haze I'd been in. I checked my watch. 10:28. I'd lost over an hour to her nonsense, and I was late for my meeting. The irritation flared again, hotter this time, but it was tempered by something else, satisfaction. She'd pushed, and I'd pushed back. Round one was mine. But as I slid into the back of my car, the envelope heavy against my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Amy didn't strike me as someone who let things go. She'd mocked me, delayed me, tried to humiliate me, and I'd walked away with a smile. That wouldn't sit well with her. And part of me, a part one hadn't let loose in years, hoped it wouldn't. I'd spent my career building power, wielding it with precision. But this was raw, personal, a fight I hadn't seen coming. And somewhere deep down, buried under the suits and the boardroom victories, I wanted to see how far it could go. The driver pulled into traffic, and I leaned back, letting my mind drift. The $30,000 was just a means to an end, a small piece of the S&T puzzle I'd locked into place. But Amy? She was something else. A loose thread I couldn't ignore. I'd laughed off her bottom-tier jab, let her think she'd gotten under my skin. But the truth was darker than that. I wasn't just annoyed by her entitlement or amused by her ignorance. I was angry. Angry at the disrespect, the wasted time, the way she'd assumed she could walk over me and not pay a price. I tapped my fingers against the envelope, the paper crinkling under my touch. I could let it go, write her off as a petty annoyance and move on. I had a $100 billion deal to close, a company to run, a life that dwarfed her little world. But as the car sped toward S&T's headquarters, the marble lobby and Amy's smirk lingered in my mind, sharp and insistent. I'd faced bigger threats, crushed stronger opponents, but this felt different. This was a challenge I hadn't chosen, a fight that had found me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to walk away. I stepped out of the car, the cold February wind slicing through my coat as I crossed the plaza toward S&T Group's headquarters. The building loomed ahead, a sleek tower of glass and steel that reflected the gray sky like a mirror, its edges sharp enough to cut. My boots echoed against the pavement, a steady rhythm that matched the pulse pounding in my ears. The envelope with the $30,000 was still tucked inside my coat, a weight I could feel against my ribs, but it wasn't the money driving me now. It was Amy, her smirk, her taunts, the way she turned a simple transaction into a battlefield. I'd won that round, walked away with the cash and my dignity intact, but the victory felt hollow. She lit something in me, a spark I couldn't ignore, and as I pushed through the revolving doors, I knew this wasn't over. The lobby swallowed me whole. Marble floors stretching out like a frozen sea, chandeliers dripping light onto the reception desk where two assistants typed in perfect sync. The air smelled of polish and power, a sterile hum that drowned out the chaos of Pinnacle Bank. I nodded at the security guard, a burly guy named Tony who'd worked here longer than I had, and headed for the elevators. My office was on the 47th floor, a corner suite with a view that could make you forget the world below even existed. It was my sanctuary, my command center, the place where I'd built an empire out of nothing. But today it felt different. Smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in. I hit the button and stepped inside, the doors sliding shut with a soft hiss. The elevator hummed upward, and I caught my reflection in the polished steel, dark hair pulled back tight, eyes sharp, mouth set in a line that could have been carved from stone. I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I felt it. A restlessness I hadn't known in years, a hunger that went beyond the deals and the boardrooms. Amy had no idea who she'd crossed, no clue about the $100 billion account tied to Pinnacle Bank, the one I could pull with a single call. And that ignorance, that blind, smug arrogance was what gnawed at me most. The doors opened, and I stepped into the executive suite. My assistant, Kate, was already there, perched at her desk with a stack of files and a coffee cup that probably hadn't been refilled since dawn. She glanced up, her sharp blue eyes catching mine, and I saw the question flicker across her face before she even spoke. "You're late," she said, her voice dry as ever. "Legal's been pacing for 20 minutes. "I know," I said, brushing past her toward my office. "Pinnacle Bank. Long story." She followed me, her heels clicking a half step behind. "Good long or bad long?" "Both." I dropped the envelope on my desk, a slab of mahogany that had cost more than most people's cars, and sank into my chair. The city sprawled out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a jagged skyline of ambition and grit. I could see Pinnacle's headquarters from here, a squat, gleaming block 3 streets over. Too close for comfort today. Kate didn't sit. She stood across from me, arms crossed, waiting. She'd been with me 6 years, long enough to know when I was rattled, even if I hid it well.
"Spill," she said.
"You look like you're plotting a murder." I laughed, short and sharp, and leaned back in my chair. "Not quite. Just dealing with someone who doesn't know when to quit." She raised an eyebrow. "Client."
"Tell her."
I tapped the envelope, the paper crinkling under my fingers.
"Amy."
From Pinnacle. Took an hour to get this because she felt like playing games. Kate's mouth twitched, amusement breaking through her usual poker face. "A teller? Seriously?" "Seriously." I let out a breath, the irritation flaring again as I replayed it. Amy's slow typing, her bottom tier jab, the way she'd smirked like she'd won something. She's got no idea who she's messing with. None. Kate tilted her head, studying me. "And that bothers you more than it should." It wasn't a question. I didn't answer, just stared out the window, my fingers drumming against the desk. She was right, and I hated it. I'd faced down CEOs who'd tried to bankrupt me, lawyers who'd twisted every word I said, and I never blinked. So why was this, some nobody with a name tag and a bad attitude, getting under my skin? Maybe it was the disrespect, the way she'd assumed I was nothing. Or maybe it was the reminder of where I'd come from, the small-town girl scrubbing tables while people like Amy sneered and demanded more. "Susan," Kate said, pulling me back. "You've got bigger fish. The acquisition closes tomorrow. Legal needs you focused." "I am focused," I snapped, sharper than I meant to. She didn't flinch, just held my gaze until I sighed and ran a hand over my face.
"Fine. You're right."
"But it's not done." She nodded, like she'd expected that. "Then handle it."
"But not now."
"Meeting's in 5." I waved her off, and she left, the door clicking shut behind her. Alone again, I swiveled my chair toward the window, the city blurring into a haze of steel and glass. Pinnacle Bank sat there, a silent taunt, and I felt that spark ignite into something hotter. Anger, yes, but laced with something darker. Revenge? Justice? I couldn't tell yet. All I knew was that Amy had pushed too far, and I wasn't the type to let it slide. The phone on my desk buzzed, Legal's line flashing. I ignored it, reaching instead for the private line I kept for emergencies. My fingers hovered over the keys, hesitating. I could call Pinnacle's CEO right now, have Amy's job gone by lunch. It'd be easy, too easy. A flick of my wrist, and she'd be out, scrambling for scraps while I moved on to the next deal. But where was the satisfaction in that? She wouldn't even know why, wouldn't feel the weight of what she'd done.
"No."
If I was going to do this, it had to sting. I punched in a different number instead. Pinnacle's transaction desk, the one tied to S&T's accounts. A voice answered, clipped and professional. Pinnacle Bank, how may I assist you? Susan Tillman, S&T Group, I said, my voice cold, steady. I need to discuss a withdrawal. $10 billion. Today. There was a pause, a hitch in the man's breathing. I'm sorry, ma'am. Did you say 10 billion?
Yes.
Cash or wire, your choice. I'll need it processed by end of day. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him typing, the faint clack of keys as he pulled up the account. Miss Tillman, I'll need to escalate this. That's not a standard request. Escalate it, I said. But I want it done. He stammered an agreement, and I hung up, leaning back in my chair. My pulse was racing now, a thrill I hadn't felt in years coursing through me. 10 billion. It was a bluff, mostly. S&T had the funds, and Pinnacle held the account, but I wasn't pulling it yet. Not really. This was a warning shot, a ripple to see how far it had spread. And I knew exactly who'd end up in its path. Minutes later, my phone rang again. Pinnacle's transaction manager, a woman named Claire I'd met at a gala last year. Her voice was tight, polite, but edged with panic. Susan, it's Claire. We just got your request. 10 billion. Is this serious? Dead serious, I said, keeping my tone flat. I'm not happy with the service lately. Thought I'd test your efficiency. She laughed, a nervous sound. You've got our attention. Look, I'll need to loop in the execs, but we'll handle it. Anything else I should know? Tell whoever's handling it to move fast, I said. I don't like waiting. I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling slightly as I set the receiver down. The office felt alive now, the air buzzing with the weight of what I'd just done. $10 billion, a number so absurd it'd make them scramble, and Amy, with her little teller window, would be caught in the chaos. I pictured her face, that smirk fading as the higher-ups descended, demanding answers she couldn't give. She'd mocked me, wasted my time, treated me like dirt under her shoe. Now she'd see what happened when you cross someone who didn't just play the game, but on the board. The door opened, Kate poking her head in. Legal's here. You ready? I stood, smoothing my coat, the envelope still heavy against my chest.
Yeah.
Let's go. But as I followed her out, my mind wasn't on the acquisition anymore. It was on Pinnacle, on Amy, on the storm I'd just unleashed. I'd spent years building this life. Power, control, a name that opened doors and closed deals. I'd told myself it was enough, that the petty fights were beneath me. But standing there, watching the city pulse below, I felt something shift. This wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about making her pay, about proving she couldn't touch me and walk away. And as the first cracks of that turning point split through my world, I realized I didn't know how far I'd go to see it through. Not yet. The elevator door slid open on the ground floor of Pinnacle Bank, and I stepped out with Kate at my side, our heels striking the marble in unison like a war drum. The lobby stretched before us, its gleam sharper now, the chandeliers overhead casting fractured light across the polished stone. I'd been here just yesterday, standing at Amy's window, swallowing her taunts while I waited for my $30,000. Today was different. Today, I wasn't asking, I was taking. The air felt charged, heavy with the weight of what I'd set in motion, and as we crossed the floor, I could feel eyes on us, tellers glancing up from their screens, customers pausing mid-conversation. They didn't know who I was, not yet, but they sensed the shift, the way you feel a storm rolling in before the first crack of thunder. Kate adjusted her suit jacket, a charcoal number that matched mine, and shot me a sidelong glance. You sure about this? 10 billion's a hell of a statement. I don't bluff, I said, my voice low, steady. Not when it's personal. She didn't argue, just nodded and kept pace. That was Kate, loyal to a fault, sharp enough to see the edges of my decisions, but smart enough not to push when I'd made up my mind. We'd walked into bigger fights than this together, hostile takeovers, boardroom coups, but this one felt raw, unpolished, like a blade I hadn't sharpened yet. Amy didn't deserve the precision I'd honed over years at S&T Group. She deserved something messier, something that'd leave a mark. The teller counters loomed ahead, a row of glass partitions manned by faces I barely registered. I scanned them, searching for her, Amy, with her cheap vest and that smirk I couldn't shake from my head. She wasn't there. Not yet. My pulse quickened, a mix of anticipation and irritation, and I steered us toward the manager's office instead, a glass-walled box tucked off to the side. Inside, a man in a gray suit hunched over a desk, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand rubbing his temple like he could will away whatever chaos I'd unleashed with my call. Claire's escalation? Kate murmured, nodding toward him. Probably, I said. Let's make it official. I didn't knock. I pushed the door open, the hinges whispering as we stepped inside, and the man, his nameplate read Michael Grayson, branch manager, jerked upright, the phone slipping from his ear. He was mid-40s, balding, with the kind of tired eyes you get from too many years dodging corporate fallout. He blinked at us, then at my suit, recognition flickering as he scrambled to his feet. "Miss Tillman," he said, voice cracking on the second syllable. I wasn't expecting you." "No one ever is," I replied, letting the words hang as I took a seat across from him. Kate stayed standing, a silent sentinel at my shoulder, her arms crossed. The office smelled of stale coffee and printer ink, a faint hum of panic clinging to the air. Papers were strewn across Grayson's desk, account summaries, transaction logs, a scribbled note with S&T circled in red. My warning shot had hit its mark. He fumbled to hang up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. "I just got off with Claire. The 10 billion request, it's being processed, but we're still verifying. That kind of withdrawal, it's unprecedented. I mean, we can do it, but I know you can." I cut in, leaning forward just enough to make him shift in his seat. "That's not why I'm here." His brow creased, confusion warring with the fear in his eyes. "Then why?" I let the silence stretch, savoring the way it pressed against him, the way his fingers twitched toward the papers like they could shield him from what was coming. Yesterday, I'd stood in this lobby as a customer, patient, restrained, letting Amy toy with me because I thought I could walk away. Today, I was Susan Tillman, EVP of S&T Group, and I was done playing. The irritation that had simmered since Bloom Deli had hardened overnight into something colder, sharper. Anger at her disrespect, yes, but also at the wasted time, the gall of her ignorance. She'd mocked me, stalled me, treated me like some nobody she could flick aside. Now she'd see what that cost. "I had an issue yesterday," I said finally, my tone flat, deliberate. "A teller, Amy, took an hour to process a $30,000 withdrawal. Thought she'd teach me a lesson, I guess." Grayson's face paled, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Amy?" I'm sorry, I didn't know. You wouldn't," I said, cutting him off again. "She didn't either. Called me bottom tier. Thought I was just another number in your system." Kate snorted softly behind me, and I caught the faintest twitch of her lips. Grayson didn't notice. He was too busy unraveling, his hands clasping and unclasping like he could wring an apology out of thin air. "That's unacceptable," he stammered. "I'll handle it, I swear." "She's new, doesn't know." "Doesn't know what?" I pressed, my voice dropping lower, colder. "That I'm the EVP of S&T Group? That the $100 billion account you manage for us hinges on my satisfaction? Or that I could close it, right now, and watch this branch sink by morning?" The words landed like blows, each one stripping the color from his face until he was a ghost in a cheap suit. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Miss Tillman, please. We value S&T. I'll fire her, No," I said, raising a hand. "I don't want her fired. Not yet." He blinked, thrown off balance. "Then what?" I leaned back, crossing my legs, the wool of my coat brushing against my knee. The office felt smaller now, the glass walls pressing in, reflecting the chaos I'd stirred. I could hear the lobby beyond, tellers whispering, phones ringing, the faint clack of keyboards as Pinnacle scrambled to process my 10 billion bluff. And somewhere out there was Amy, oblivious to the storm I'd unleashed, still thinking she'd won yesterday's little game. That ignorance amused me, a dark, twisted thread weaving through the anger that had brought me here. She had no idea who I was, no clue about the power I held over her tiny world. And that was the point. I want her to know, I said, my gaze locking onto Grayson's. I want her to understand exactly who she crossed. And then I want her to feel it. He swallowed hard, nodding like a man staring down a loaded gun. I'll bring her in.
Right now.
You can… No, I said again, sharper this time. Not here. Not like this. I'll handle it myself. Kate shifted behind me, a silent question in the air, but I didn't acknowledge it. Grayson just stared, lost, until I stood, smoothing my coat as I towered over his desk. Process the 10 billion, I said. Keep it moving. I'll let you know if I pull it. Miss Tillman, he started, half rising. If there's anything else… There isn't, I said, turning for the door. Not yet. Kate fell into step beside me as we left, the glass door swinging shut on Grayson's stunned silence. The lobby opened up again, a sea of marble and murmurs, and there she was, Amy, stepping out from a back room, her vest crooked, her bun as messy as ever. She didn't see us at first, her head down as she shuffled papers, but then she glanced up, and her eyes met mine across the floor. That smirk flickered, faint but there, like she thought this was round 2 of yesterday's game. Susan, Kate murmured, her voice a warning. You sure? Dead sure, I said, and started toward her. The distance closed fast, my heels clicking a steady beat, Kate a shadow at my side. Amy straightened as I approached, her smirk widening into something cocky, oblivious. Back for more? She called, loud enough to draw a few heads. What's it this time, 50 grand? I stopped a foot from her counter, close enough to see the faint smudge of mascara under her eyes, the way her fingers tightened on the paper she held. The lobby faded, the hum of voices and clatter of keys blurring into nothing. It was just her and me now, and the weight of everything I'd built, the years, the deals, the power, pressed against my chest, begging to be let loose. No, I said, my voice low, calm, a blade wrapped in silk. This time, it's 10 billion. Her smirk froze, then twitched, confusion creeping in.
What?
$10 billion, I repeated, stepping closer, my shadow falling across her counter. That's what I requested today. Cash or wire, their choice. Pinnacle scrambling to make it happen. And you know why. She blinked, her bravado cracking, but she didn't back down. You're full of it. No one walks in here with that kind of… Susan Tillman, I said, cutting her off, my name a hammer strike. Executive Vice President, S&T Group. The $100 billion account your bank manages? That's mine. And yesterday, you wasted my time, mocked me, treated me like dirt. So today, I'm testing how much Pinnacle values that account and you. Her face shifted, shock first, then disbelief, then something uglier, a mix of fear and defiance. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, her hands trembling against the counter. I could feel Kate beside me, tense, ready to step in, but I didn't need her. Not for this. You didn't know. I went on, my voice steady, relentless. You thought I was nothing.
Bottom tier, right?
But here's the truth, Amy. I could close that account right now. One call and this branch, your job, your little power trip's gone. You'd be back at Bloom Deli, fighting over sandwich discounts. Only this time, no one's hiring. She flinched, the papers slipping from her grip, scattering across the counter. The lobby was silent now, every eye on us, but I didn't care. This wasn't for them. It was for her, for the way she'd smirked, stalled, assumed she could walk over me and not pay a price. My anger burned cold, precise, but underneath it was something else. Amusement at how blind she'd been, how small her world was next to mine. And deeper still, a flicker of something I didn't expect. Understanding. She was desperate, clawing for control in a life that gave her none. I'd been there once, a lifetime ago. But that didn't excuse her. It just made this sweeter. "So what?" she spat, finding her voice, though it shook. "You're gonna ruin me over withdrawal? That's pathetic." "No," I said, smiling now, thin and sharp. "I'm not ruining you. I'm showing you. Next time you pick a fight, make sure you know who's on the other side." I turned, leaving her there, the papers fluttering to the floor. Kate followed, her silence louder than any words as we crossed the lobby, the weight of Amy's stare burning into my back. Outside, the cold hit me again, sharp and grounding, and I stopped, letting it sink in. I'd revealed myself, dropped the mask, and it felt good, better than I'd expected. But it wasn't enough.
Not yet.
"She's not done," Kate said, stepping up beside me, her breath fogging in the air. "I know," I replied, my eyes on Pinnacle's gleaming facade. "Neither am I." The wind whipped past me as I stood outside Pinnacle Bank, its glass facade towering overhead like a smug monument to my morning's chaos. My breath fogged in the frigid February air, curling upward and dissipating as quickly as my patience had earlier. Kate lingered at my side, her arms crossed tight against the cold, her sharp eyes scanning my face for a tell, some crack in the armor I'd worn since storming out of Grayson's office. I didn't give her one. Not yet. My pulse still thrummed with the thrill of what I'd done, dropping my title on Amy like a live grenade and walking away before it detonated. But the satisfaction was already souring, replaced by a gnawing restlessness I couldn't name. "Let's eat," I said, breaking the silence. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Bloom Deli's close." Kate raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching into a half-smirk. "You sure that's wise? You're 0 for 2 on peaceful lunches there." "I'm not looking for peace," I replied, turning toward the deli's direction. "I'm looking for a sandwich." She didn't argue, just fell into step beside me as we crossed the street, the city pulsing around us, horns blaring, pedestrians shoving past, the low hum of power that never slept. The deli was 3 blocks east, a squat brick building dwarfed by the steel giants looming over it. From the outside, it looked like nothing. A faded awning, grimy windows, a neon open sign flickering like it was on its last breath. Inside, though, it was alive. The clatter of trays, the sizzle of the grill, the sharp tang of mustard and pickles cutting through the air. I'd come here for years, a ritual carved out of a life that rarely left room for anything small. Today, it felt like walking into a trap I'd set myself. The door jangled as we stepped in, the lunchtime crowd thicker than yesterday, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder at the counter. I scanned the room, my eyes catching on familiar details: the chipped counter where I'd stood watching Amy's coupon tantrum, the wobbly tables shoved against the walls, the cashier, still that same nervous kid, fumbling with change. The air was warm, heavy with grease and noise, and it pressed against me, tightening the knot in my chest. I wasn't here for nostalgia. I was here because something in me wouldn't let go. Not of Amy, not of the fight she'd started, not of the way she'd turned my world into her playground. "Turkey on whole wheat?" Kate asked, already moving toward the line. "Yeah," I said, my gaze drifting past her.
No mayo.
She nodded and stepped up to order, leaving me by the door, the crowd parting slightly as I stood there, coat still buttoned tight. I should have felt in control. Susan Tillman, EVP of S&T Group, a woman who could topple empires with a phone call. But standing here, the deli's chaos buzzing in my ears, I felt exposed, raw, like the power I'd wielded at Pinnacle was slipping through my fingers. Amy's face flashed in my mind, her shock when I'd revealed myself, the tremor in her hands as her papers hit the floor. I'd wanted her to feel small, to taste the weight of her mistake, and I'd succeeded. So why did it feel like I was the one unraveling? The door jangled again, sharp and sudden, cutting through the deli's din. I turned, instinct tightening my shoulders, and there she was, Amy, stepping inside like she'd been summoned by my thoughts. Her bank vest was gone, swapped for a wrinkled hoodie, her bun looser now, strands of hair clinging to her flushed cheeks. She didn't see me at first, her eyes darting to the counter as she shoved her hands into her pockets, her posture hunched like a cornered animal. Then she looked up, and our gazes locked, the air between us crackling with something I couldn't name: anger, fear, defiance, all of it tangled into a live wire. "You," she said, her voice slicing through the noise, loud enough to turn heads. She took a step toward me, her sneakers scuffing the linoleum, her jaw tight. What the hell was that back there? I didn't flinch, didn't step back. I just stood there, letting her close the distance, my hands steady at my sides. "You tell me," I said, calm, cold. "You're the one who started it." "Started it?" She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that drew more eyes. Customers pausing mid-bite, the cashier freezing with a tray in his hands. "You come into my bank, throw around some bullshit about $10 billion, and I'm supposed to just take it? Who do you think you are?" "I told you who I am," I said, my voice low, steady, cutting through her bluster like a blade. "Susan Tillman. S&T Group. You didn't listen." Her face twisted, shock giving way to fury, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "Oh, I listened. I heard every word of your little power trip. You think you can scare me? Ruin my life over some stupid withdrawal?" "I didn't ruin anything," I said, stepping closer, close enough to see the sweat beading on her forehead, the way her breath hitched. "You did that yourself. You mocked me, stalled me, treated me like nothing. I just showed you the consequences." "Consequences?" She spat the word, her voice rising, trembling now. "You're insane. You're a psycho with too much money and no soul. I've got a kid, a rent I can barely pay, and you're out here playing God because I didn't kiss your ass fast enough?" The deli shrank around us, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the weight of her words. A kid, rent, a life teetering on the edge. I knew that story, had lived it once, scrubbed diner floors to pay for a bus ticket out. For a second, I felt it, a flicker of something soft, a crack in the anger that had driven me here. But then I saw her smirk again, that same cocky twist from yesterday, and it snuffed out. She wasn't sorry. She was desperate, sure, but she'd still picked this fight, still assumed she could win. And I wasn't about to let her guilt me into backing down. "You made a choice," I said, my tone flat, unyielding. "You don't get to cry about it now." Her eyes flared, and she lunged forward, closing the gap until we were inches apart, her breath hot against my face. "You think you're untouchable? You think this is over? I'll..." "Enough." Kate's voice cut through, sharp and final, as she stepped between us, her hand on Amy's shoulder, pushing her back with a force that surprised me. Amy stumbled, catching herself against a table, her glare shifting to Kate, then back to me, wild and unhinged. "Back off," Kate said, her tone low, lethal, the kind she used on boardroom rivals who'd crossed a line. "You don't know what you're stepping into." Amy's chest heaved, her hands trembling, but she didn't move. The deli was silent now, every eye on us. Customers frozen, the cashier gaping, the grill hissing faintly in the background. I could feel the tension coiling tighter, a spring about to snap, and part of me wanted it to. I wanted her to push harder, to give me a reason to unleash everything I'd held back. The years of clawing up, the deals I'd bled for, the power I'd built brick by brick. But another part, buried deeper, whispered something darker. "Asterisk, she's breaking. You've already won. Asterisk, Susan," Kate said, her voice softer now, a tether pulling me back. "Let's go." I didn't move, didn't break Amy's stare. Her eyes were wet, her defiance crumbling, and I felt it. The shift. The moment she realized she wasn't just outmatched but outclassed. My anger burned hot, fueled by her disrespect, her ignorance, but there was something else too. Amusement, cold and sharp, at how small she looked now, how blind she'd been. I could destroy her. Had the means, the will, the justification. One call to Grayson, and she'd be jobless by dusk. But standing there, the deli's heat pressing against me, I wasn't sure that was enough anymore. "You're done?" I said finally, my voice a quiet blade. "Walk away, Amy, while you still can." She flinched, her fists unclenching, her shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of her. For a second, I thought she'd say something. Another jab, a plea, anything. But she just turned, shoving past a table and storming toward the door. It slammed shut behind her, the jangle echoing in the silence, and the deli exhaled, the crowd stirring back to life like nothing had happened. Kate handed me my sandwich, her expression unreadable. "You okay?" "No," I said, taking it, the paper crinkling under my fingers. "But I will be." We stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a slap, grounding me as the adrenaline ebbed. My mind raced, replaying it. Amy's fury, her desperation, the way she'd crumbled. I'd wanted her to feel it, and she had. But the pressure in my chest didn't ease. It grew, twisting into something heavier. Anger at her, yes, but also at myself. I'd revealed too much, let her drag me down to her level, turned a petty grudge into a public brawl. I was Susan Tillman, not some street fighter scrapping over pride. So, why did it feel like I'd lost something in there? "Pinnacle's still scrambling," Kate said, pulling me back as we walked. "Grayson called while you were staring her down. They're begging for a meeting." "Let them beg," I replied, my voice tight. "I'm not done yet." She nodded, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, concern, maybe, or doubt. I ignored it, focusing on the deli fading behind us, the city swallowing it whole. Amy was a spark, a fuse I'd let burn too long, and now the fire was spreading. Pinnacle, Grayson, the 10 billion bluff, it was all closing in, a crisis I'd built with my own hands. And as we turned the corner, the weight of it pressed harder. A question I couldn't shake. How far was I willing to take this? Revenge felt good, justice better, but the cost was climbing, and I wasn't sure I could stop. The marble lobby of Pinnacle Bank stretched out before me like a battlefield, its polished floor reflecting the late afternoon light in sharp, unforgiving angles. The chandeliers glittered overhead, their glow cold and distant, casting shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts of every deal I'd ever closed. I stood near the entrance, my coat draped over my arm, the weight of the day pressing against my ribs. Kate flanked me, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. The air smelled of money, crisp bills, leather briefcases, the faint tang of desperation, and it hung heavy, thick with the tension I'd carried here from Bloom Deli. This wasn't just a visit. It was a reckoning. Grayson's office door swung open across the lobby, and he stumbled out, his gray suit rumpled, his face a mask of frayed nerves. He spotted us immediately, his steps quickening as he crossed the floor, dodging a teller pushing a cart of files. The lobby hummed around us, phones ringing, voices murmuring, the clack of keyboards a steady drumbeat, but it all faded as he approached, his hands clasped like a man pleading for mercy. "Miss Tillman," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank God you're here. We've been trying to reach you all day." "I've been busy," I replied, my tone flat, deliberate. I didn't move, didn't offer a handshake. I just stood there, letting him squirm under my gaze. The irritation from Amy's deli outburst still burned in my chest, a live coal stoked by every second I'd spent replaying her words. Asterisk psycho with too much money and no soul star. She'd thrown that at me like a weapon, and it had hit harder than I'd let on. Not because it was true, but because it dared me to prove her wrong or right. Grayson wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his eyes darting to Kate, then back to me. "The 10 billion request, it's moving, but it's chaos. We've got execs on the line, auditors scrambling. If you're serious about pulling it, I am." I cut in, stepping closer, my boots clicking against the marble. "But that's not why I'm here." His Adam's apple bobbed, confusion flickering across his face. "Then what?" "Amy," I said, the name a blade I wielded with care. "Her misconduct. I told you I'd handle it myself. This is me handling it." He blinked, thrown, his hands twitching at his sides. "Amy? She's on break." After this morning, I put her on notice, but get her, I said, my voice low, unyielding.
Now.
Grayson hesitated, then nodded, retreating toward the teller counters with the gait of a man walking to his own execution. I watched him go, my pulse steady but loud in my ears, a rhythm that matched the storm building inside me. The lobby felt smaller now, its gleam oppressive, the walls pressing in with every breath I took. I'd come here to expose her, to strip away the last shred of her smug ignorance, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about me, about the anger that had festered since that first sandwich squabble, the disrespect I'd swallowed, the time she'd stolen. I'd built my life on control, on turning losses into wins, but Amy had cracked that facade, and I needed to see this through. Kate shifted beside me, her voice a murmur. "You're sure this is the play?" "It's the only play," I said, my eyes locked on the spot where Grayson had disappeared. She doesn't get to walk away clean. She didn't argue, just nodded, her silence a tether keeping me grounded. I could feel the weight of her trust, her readiness to follow me into whatever this became. We'd faced bigger stakes, hostile boards, billion-dollar gambles, but this was personal, a fight I'd chosen, and it was spiraling faster than I'd planned. Grayson reappeared, Amy trailing behind him like a shadow reluctant to step into the light. Her hoodie was gone, replaced by that crooked bank vest, her hair a mess of loose strands framing a face flushed with defiance and something else. Fear, maybe, or exhaustion. She stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed tight, her eyes darting from Grayson to me. The lobby's hum dulled, its edges blurring as she met my gaze, that familiar smirk twitching at her lips, weaker now but still there. "You again," she said, her voice sharp but unsteady. "What? You didn't get enough at the deli?" I didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. I just stepped forward, closing the distance until the counter was the only thing between us, its cold edge pressing against my thighs. "No," I said, my voice calm, a steel thread running through it. "I didn't. But we're finishing this now." She laughed, a short, brittle sound that echoed off the marble, but it died fast, her smirk faltering as she caught the look in my eyes. "Finishing what?"
Your ego trip.
"You've already made your point, big shot."
Have I?
I leaned in, my hands flat on the counter, my shadow falling across her. "Because I don't think you get it, Amy. You mocked me, stalled me, treated me like nothing twice. You thought you could play your little games and walk away. You were wrong." Her jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists at her sides, but she didn't back down. "So what? You're gonna fire me? Ruin my life? You think that makes you better than me?" "No," I said, my voice dropping lower, colder. "I don't need to fire you. Pinnacle's already scrambling because of me. That 10 billion request? It's real. And when it hits, they'll be looking for someone to blame. Guess who they'll pick?" Her eyes widened, shock breaking through her bravado, but she rallied fast, leaning forward to match me. "You're bluffing. No one pulls that kind of money over a teller." "Try me," I said, smiling now, thin and sharp. "I'm Susan Tillman, S&T Group. That $100 billion account your bank lives on?
Mine.
One word from me, and it's gone. You're not just a teller. You're the reason they're sweating right now." The color drained from her face, her fists unclenching as her hands fell limp against the counter. Grayson shifted behind her, his nervous mutterings lost in the silence that swallowed the lobby. I could feel the eyes on us, tellers pausing mid-transaction, customers craning their necks. But it didn't matter. This was her moment, her reckoning, and I wanted her to feel every second of it. "You're lying," she whispered, but it was weak, a plea more than a challenge. "You wouldn't, I would." I cut in, relentless. "And I might. Because you didn't just waste my time, Amy. You disrespected me. You assumed I was nothing and you were wrong. Now you pay the price." Her breath hitched, her eyes darting to Grayson, then back to me, wild and searching. I've got a kid. I need this job." "You can't. You should have thought of that," I said, straightening, my hands sliding off the counter. before you picked a fight you couldn't win. She flinched, her shoulders slumping, and for a second, I saw it. The crack, the moment she broke. Her defiance crumbled, leaving something raw and desperate in its place, and I felt a surge of satisfaction so sharp it almost hurt. This was what I'd wanted. Her small, her humbled, her realizing exactly who she'd crossed. The anger that had driven me here, hot and jagged since Bloom Delhi, cooled into something else, a cold, precise triumph. I'd shown her, stripped her bare, and it felt good. But then she spoke, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "You're a monster. You think this is justice? This is just power." The words hit me harder than I expected, a slap that echoed through the hollow space where my victory should have settled. I froze, my pulse spiking, the lobby's gleam suddenly too bright, too harsh. A monster. I'd heard worse, ruthless, cold, a shark in a suit, but this stuck, burrowing under my skin. I'd wanted justice, hadn't I? Revenge for her disrespect, her ignorance, the way she'd chipped away at my control. But standing here, watching her crumble, I felt the first flicker of doubt. Was this justice? Or was it just me flexing, proving a point because I could? Kate's hand brushed my arm, a silent anchor, but I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Amy, on the way her hands shook, the way her breath came in short, ragged bursts. She was right about one thing. This was power. I'd wielded it like a weapon, and she was collateral damage. I'd spent years climbing out of desperation like hers, turning it into something unstoppable. But now, staring at her, I saw a shadow of the girl I'd been, scared, scrappy, fighting for every inch. The realization twisted in my gut, sharp and unwelcome. "Susan," Kate murmured, her voice low, urgent. "Enough." I didn't move, didn't speak. The lobby pressed in, the air thick with the weight of what I'd done. I could end it here, walk away, let Pinnacle deal with her, let the 10 billion bluff fade into nothing. Or I could push harder, close the account, make her feel the full cost of crossing me. My mind raced, torn between the satisfaction of her defeat and the gnawing question she'd planted. What was this costing me? Grayson stepped forward, his voice shaky. "Miss Tillman, please. We'll discipline her, suspension, retraining, whatever you want. Just tell us what to do." I held Amy's gaze, her eyes wet now, her defiance gone. She didn't beg, didn't plead, just stared, waiting for the blow. And in that moment, I felt it shift, the anger, the triumph, the need to win. It didn't vanish, but it dulled, overshadowed by something heavier, the truth that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about me, about the line I'd crossed, the one I hadn't seen until now. "Suspend her," I said finally, my voice steady but quieter than before. 2 weeks. No pay. She keeps her job for now. Grayson nodded fast, relief flooding his face, but Amy just stared, her expression unreadable. I turned, breaking the connection, and started for the doors, Kate falling into step beside me. The lobby's hum surged back, tellers whispering, phones ringing, life resuming as if nothing had shattered here. But it had. For her. For me. Outside, the cold hit me like a wall, the wind clawing at my face as I stopped, letting it sink in. My hands trembled slightly, adrenaline ebbing, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. I'd won, exposed her, secured my justice, but it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a weight, a cost I hadn't calculated. "She's right, isn't she?" I said, my voice barely audible over the city's roar. "About the power." Kate stopped beside me, her breath fogging in the air. "Maybe, but she pushed you there. You didn't start this." "Didn't I?" I turned to her, searching her face for an answer she couldn't give. I could have walked away. At the deli, at the bank, anytime. I didn't. She didn't respond, just held my gaze, her silence louder than words. The city pulsed around us, Pinnacle's facade gleaming in the dusk, a silent witness to the storm I'd unleashed. I'd wanted Amy to pay, and she had. But standing here, the victory tasted bitter, tangled with a question I couldn't shake. How much of myself had I given up to make it happen? The cold bit into my knuckles as I stood outside Pinnacle Bank, the wind howling through the concrete canyon of the city like it was trying to scrape the day clean. My breath fogged in front of me, curling upward and vanishing into the gray dusk, a fleeting ghost of the fire I'd carried inside just moments ago. Kate stood beside me, her coat pulled tight, her sharp eyes fixed on the street ahead, but I could feel her presence like a steady hand on my shoulder. The bank's glass facade loomed behind us, a silent giant reflecting the last slivers of daylight, its gleam mocking the hollow ache settling in my chest. I'd won. Amy was suspended, Pinnacle was scrambling, my power undeniable, but the victory felt heavy, a weight I hadn't expected to carry. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice rougher than I intended, the words half lost in the wind. Bloom Deli. One last stop. Kate's head turned, her brow lifting slightly. "You sure? That place is starting to feel like a cursed talisman." I forced a smile, thin and brittle. "Maybe it is, but I need to see it through." She didn't push, just nodded and started walking, her heels clicking a steady rhythm against the pavement. The city pulsed around us, cars honking, lights flickering on in skyscrapers, the low hum of life that never stopped, but it felt distant, like I was moving through a dream I couldn't wake from. 3 blocks later, the deli's faded awning came into view, sagging over the brick storefront like a tired sigh. The neon open sign buzzed faintly, its red glow stuttering in the gloom, and through the grimy windows, I could see the lunchtime crowd had thinned to a handful of stragglers nursing coffee and crumbs. We pushed through the door, the jangle of the bell sharp against the muted chatter inside. The air hit me like a memory, warm, thick with the scent of rye and grease, the faint tang of pickles cutting through it all. The chipped linoleum creaked under my boots, and the counter stretched out ahead, smudged with fingerprints and decades of wear. It was the same as always, same wobbly tables, same peeling menu board, same nervous cashier glancing up from the register, but it felt different now, smaller, like the walls had shrunk since I'd faced Amy here hours ago. I'd come full circle, back to where this mess started, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Kate slid into a seat by the window, her back to the glass, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert. I stayed standing, my coat still over my arm, my gaze drifting across the room. The cashier, a kid with acne and a shaky smile, nodded at me, recognition flickering in his eyes. He'd seen the showdown earlier, watched Amy storm out, and now he moved with the cautious haste of someone who knew trouble could walk back in any second. I ordered turkey on whole wheat, no mayo, same as always, and leaned against the counter, letting the deli's hum settle over me like a blanket I didn't want. "You think they'll fire her?" Kate asked, her voice low, cutting through the clatter of a tray hitting the counter behind me. "Grayson won't," I said, my fingers tapping the edge of my coat. "He's too scared of me pulling the account. But the execs might. Depends how much they need a scapegoat." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "And you're okay with that?" I didn't answer right away. The question hung there, heavy and barbed, digging into the doubt I'd felt in the lobby. The flicker of unease when Amy called me a monster, the twist in my gut when I saw her break. Was I okay with it? I'd wanted her to pay, to feel the sting of her disrespect, and she had. 2 weeks without pay, a job hanging by a thread, she'd taste every ounce of that cost. But standing here, the deli's warmth pressing against my skin, I wasn't sure it was enough, or if it was too much. Before I could respond, the door jangled again, sharp and insistent, and my head snapped up. There she was, Amy, stepping inside like a shadow I couldn't shake, her hoodie back on, her hair a tangled mess framing a face pale and drawn. She didn't see me at first, her eyes fixed on the counter as she shuffled forward, her shoulders hunched, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. The cashier froze, his hands hovering over my sandwich, and the room seemed to hold its breath, the air thickening with the weight of her presence. Then she looked up, and our eyes met, and time slowed. Her face shifted, shock first, Then something harder, a flicker of the defiance I'd crushed at Pinnacle. She stopped short, her sneakers scuffing the floor, and for a moment, I thought she'd turn and run. But she didn't. She straightened, her jaw tightening, and took a step toward me, her voice cutting through the silence like a cracked whip. "You happy now?" she said, loud enough to draw every eye in the place. 2 weeks, no pay, and they're talking termination. That enough for you? Or are you gonna burn the whole bank down too? I didn't flinch, didn't step back. I just stood there, my hands steady at my sides, letting her words hit me. The deli shrank around us, the walls pressing in, the heat and noise fading into a dull roar. "You brought this on yourself," I said, my voice calm, cold, a steel thread I'd sharpened over years of fights bigger than this. "You mocked me, wasted my time, thought you could walk over me. This is what happens." Her laugh was bitter, jagged, echoing off the chipped counter. "What happens? You ruin my life over a sandwich and a withdrawal? You're pathetic, Susan. All that power, and this is what you do with it." The cashier slid my sandwich across the counter, his hands trembling, but I ignored it, my eyes locked on hers. She was smaller now, humbled, her bravado stripped bare, but there was still a spark in her, anger, desperation, a refusal to bow completely. And it hit me, sharp and sudden. I'd seen that spark before in myself, years ago, when I was the one clawing for scraps, fighting a world that didn't care. I'd turned it into power, into S&T Group, into a life she couldn't fathom. But standing here, watching her tremble, I felt the echo of that girl I'd been, and it twisted something deep inside me. "You don't get it," I said, stepping closer, my boots clicking against the linoleum. "This wasn't about a sandwich.
It was about respect.
You didn't give it, so I took it." Her eyes flashed, wet and furious, and she leaned in, her voice dropping to a hiss. "Respect? You think this is respect? You've got a kid at home who won't eat because of you. You've got me begging for a job I hate, and you're standing there like some queen. You're not better than me. You're just richer." The words landed like blows, each one heavier than the last, and I felt the deli tilt beneath me, the air growing too thick to breathe. A kid. Hunger. Begging. I'd known she was desperate, had seen it in her defiance, her clinging to control, but hearing it raw like that cracked something in me, a fissure I hadn't expected. My anger flared, hot and familiar, but it was tangled now with something else, guilt, maybe, or the ghost of a conscience I'd buried under years of wins. Kate stood, her chair scraping the floor, her voice cutting through the haze. "Back off, Amy. You're done here." Amy's had snapped toward her, then back to me, her hands balling into fists.
No.
"I'm not done. She doesn't get to walk away like this." She turned to the counter, her voice rising again, shaky but loud. "Hey, kid, got any openings? I'll scrub floors, flip burgers, whatever. I need this." The cashier blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, and I saw it. The moment she broke completely, begging in the same place she'd strutted 2 days ago. The irony was brutal, and part of me wanted to savor it, to let the satisfaction of her humiliation wash over me. I'd revealed my power, secured my justice, and here she was, groveling at my feet. But it didn't feel good. It felt hollow, a victory carved out of someone else's ruin, and the weight of it pressed harder against my chest. "No openings," the cashier stammered, glancing at me like I'd ordered the rejection myself. "Sorry, ma'am." Amy's shoulders slumped, her breath hitching, and she turned back to me, her eyes blazing through the tears. "You win, okay?
You win.
Happy now?" I didn't answer, couldn't. My throat was tight, my pulse pounding in my ears, and all I could do was watch as she shoved past me, the door slamming shut behind her with a jangle that echoed like a gunshot. The deli exhaled, the stragglers turning back to their coffee, but the silence lingered between me and Kate, thick and suffocating. "Sit," Kate said finally, her voice softer than before, a tether pulling me back. I sank into the chair across from her, my sandwich untouched on the table, the paper crinkling under my fingers as I stared at it. The warmth of the deli pressed against me, but it couldn't touch the cold spreading inside, a chill that had nothing to do with the February wind outside. "She's right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the words tasting bitter as they left me. I didn't have to go this far. Kate leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her gaze steady. "You didn't start it, Susan. She pushed you over and over. You reacted." "Did I?" I met her eyes, searching for an answer she couldn't give. I could have stopped at the deli, at the bank.
I didn't.
I wanted her to hurt, Kate. I wanted her to feel it. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. And she did. Question is, what's it cost you? I laughed, a short, dry sound that scraped my throat. Everything I've built, it's supposed to be above this. I'm Susan Tillman, EVP of S&T Group, not some petty tyrant scrapping with a teller. But here I am. "You're human," she said, her tone flat, unyielding. "You've spent years proving you're not, but you are." She hit a nerve and you hit back. That's it. The simplicity of it stung, cutting through the tangle of anger and guilt knotting my chest. Human. I'd clawed my way up from nothing, turned every slight into fuel, every loss into a lesson, until I was untouchable, or so I'd thought. Amy had cracked that, exposed the raw nerve I'd buried, and I'd lashed out with everything I had. Pinnacle was safe, my $100 billion account intact, my power reaffirmed. But sitting here, the deli's hum fading into the background, I felt the cost, the piece of myself I'd traded for this win, the line I'd crossed without looking back. I picked up the sandwich, took a bite, the bread crunching under my teeth, but it tasted like ash. "I'm done with her," I said finally, setting it down. "No more moves. Pinnacle can figure out what to do with her." Kate nodded, sipping her coffee, her silence a quiet agreement. The deli settled around us, the cashier wiping down the counter, the last customers shuffling out into the dusk. I leaned back, my eyes drifting to the window, the city's lights flickering to life beyond the glass. The anger was gone, burned out, leaving a strange calm in its wake. Not satisfaction, not quite peace, but something close. A release, maybe. I'd fought. I'd won. And now I could let it go. "Back to work tomorrow," I said, more to myself than to Kate. "The acquisition's closing. Bigger fish." "Always are," she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You good?" I thought about it, really thought, letting the question settle. The weight was still there, lighter now but not gone, a reminder of what I'd done, what I'd risked. But I could carry it. I'd carried worse. "Yeah," I said at last, standing, smoothing my coat. "I'm good." We stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a cleanse, the wind sweeping away the last traces of the deli's heat. Pinnacle loomed in the distance, its glass glowing against the darkening sky, but it didn't pull at me anymore. Neither did Amy. She was a chapter closed, a lesson learned, one I wouldn't forget. As we walked away, the city swallowing us whole, I felt the first stirrings of something new, not regret, not triumph, but a quiet resolve. I'd stumbled, flexed power I didn't need to, but I'd come through it. And tomorrow, I'd climb back into the world I'd built, stronger for it.